Okay, in this lesson, we're going to go through an overview of propositional logic. This is going to be a short lesson, but I wanted to give you a general picture of where we're going. Okay, this may not make perfect sense to you the first time that you go through this lesson. So I would recommend that as you're going through the different steps of learning this, you might refer back to this lesson when you're ever just sort of lost and like, why are we doing this? This is a good place to go back to. So this is an overview of propositional logic. And to do this, I wanted to give you a sense of what we're working towards. What is it that we want to be able to do? And the answer to that is that we want to be able to determine if a deductive argument is valid or not. That's our goal. We want to be able to determine whether the inference is good in a deductive argument. If you'll recall from chapters 1 and 2, when we talk about arguments and how to critically evaluate them, there are really only ever two things that we worry about. Number one, are the premises true? And number two, is the inference good? Well, we're focusing here, when we want to know whether a deductive argument is valid or not, valid is our term, valid and invalid are our terms of assessment for the inference of a deductive argument. And remember, the inference in a deductive argument is different than the inference in an inductive argument. Again, to restate this, with a deductive argument, the premises are supposed to guarantee, demonstrate, prove the conclusion, whereas with an inductive argument, they are intended to make the conclusion more likely. The premises are intended to make the conclusion more likely. So we want to be able to determine, that's what all that we're doing here, is looking at the second issue. We're looking at the inference of a deductive argument. We want to decide if it's good or not. And if it's good, we call it valid, and if it's not, we call it invalid. So we want to know whether a deductive argument is valid or invalid. Now, how are we going to do that? If that's our goal for this entire section of the course, if that's our goal, is to learn how to do that, how will we do that? What are we looking to do? Well, here we go, right? Since the validity of a deductive argument is a function of the argument's form, not its content, since it has to do with the form of the argument, not the content of the argument, we need to do two things. Number one, we're going to need to learn how to isolate the form of the argument we're considering. When I say that, what I mean is, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the content of the claims that make up an argument. Now remember, a claim or a statement or a proposition is just a basic unit of thought that has a truth value. That's what it is. And our goal here will be to expose and remove the content of every individual claim that constitutes an argument. There will be several. There will be more than one. There will be at least two, potentially more, claims that make up an argument. Very often three or more that make up an argument. Why is this? Not why is this? Why am I asking that question? So we're going to, in each instance, remove the content that makes up the argument. And once we've done that, then, having removed the content and placed in content holders, what we can do is indicate then the structure of the argument, or really what we mean is the way that the propositions or the claims whose content we just removed relate to one another, what kind of relationship they bear to one another. Okay? Now, again, this will seem a little bit vague at first, but trust me, it will make sense as we go forward. And again, come back to this lesson if you're ever confused about what precisely we're doing. Once we know, here's the second step, once we know the form of an argument, once we've removed the content and we are able to see nothing but the form of the argument, we can then test for its validity by constructing a truth table to see if it's valid or not. That is, to see what we mean when it's valid is whether or not it's possible for the premises of that argument to be true and its conclusion to be false. Sorry, I'm tripping up on something. I've got it's in here twice, and the first time I've got an apostrophe between IT and S, and it shouldn't be there, and the second time it should be there. I'm a bit of a grammar freak, and I sucked at that. I missed that one, so that wouldn't be the first thing I've screwed up on the slides, but just so you know, I know. Anyways, that's what we're doing. We're really only doing two things in this section. Now, learning to do these two things is going to be a bit challenging, okay? At times, but once you've got it, you're going to nail it. It becomes so easy. It's really not that difficult. It's just new. And once you learn the procedures for doing it, you will have this section nailed. So the next slide is just, you know, what the fudge, right? What exactly does that mean? Well, let me give you some concrete. So consider this argument, right? Let's say that I made the following argument. You know, to be a good president, one has to have integrity. And clearly Mrs. Clinton has integrity, so Mrs. Clinton must be a good president. Now, when we critically evaluate this argument, right, we know the two steps to look for. Number one, are the premises true, right? How do we evaluate that deductive argument? Step one, are the premises true? Is it true that to be a good president, one must have integrity? Well, that's a good question. I don't know. Perhaps you could be a good president without integrity. I wouldn't think so. I would think that part of being a good president would be to have integrity. But, you know, we'll leave that alone for a second. Mrs. Clinton has integrity. I don't know if that's true or false. Lots of questions surrounding Mrs. Clinton and her integrity. But, you know, there we go. Now the conclusion here is 3, so Ms. Clinton must be a good president. Is this conclusion true or false? Well, notice that this is an argument. So the reason that we should accept that Mrs. Clinton is a good president is not just because we think she's a good president. It's because to be a good president, you have to have integrity, and Mrs. Clinton has integrity. That's why this person thinks that you should accept that Mrs. Clinton is a good president, must be a good president. So, are the premises true? Well, that I don't know. We'd have to think about that, and we could have a discussion about that. That one's open to interpretation. But here's what's not open to interpretation. Here's what's not really open to discussion. That's the question of whether or not, if those premises are true, they would guarantee that conclusion. That is this argument valid? Is the inference good? Independent of whether or not the premises are true, if it were true that to be a good president you have to have integrity, and if it is true that Ms. Clinton has integrity, does that guarantee that Ms. Clinton is a good president? That's the question. So how do we decide if this is a good argument or not? Now, I'll tell you that this is in fact not a good argument. And I know that from experience. I can look through this argument and I can see its structure to know that this is not a good argument. And some of you may think that it's not a good argument because you don't like the conclusion or because you think that the premises are false. But this is also not a good argument because the form of the argument is bad. And that's what I want you to be able to see by the end of this section. So to know if this deductive argument is valid, we got to remove the content, and then we're going to construct what we call a truth table, and I'll explain to you later what that is, to see if it's possible for 1 and 2 to be true and for 3 to be false. If that's the case, if that's possible, then the argument is invalid. But if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, listen carefully to what I'm saying. If it is not possible for the premises to be true, for 1 and 2 to be true, and for 3 to be false, if that can't be the case, then the argument is valid. Then the premises, if true, would guarantee the conclusion. How could that be? Well, if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, then the only possibility is for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be true, which means that the premises guarantee the conclusion. Rewind that back if you need to. Okay. Now, there are some limitations on what we'll be doing in this chapter, and I've mentioned them before, but I want to be very clear, or I'm sorry, in this section, I want to be very clear about what they are, about what we're after. We are not worried when we look at arguments about whether the premises or the conclusion are true or false. That's not the purpose of this section. Now, when you evaluate arguments, you will definitely be concerned with that. But that's not the purpose. That's not what I'm trying to teach you here. I'm trying to teach you in this section how to evaluate that second phase of an argument in critical evaluation, whether the inference is good. So we are only concerned with validity. And again, here's 2 ways of stating what it means for an argument to be valid. Ready? If the premises are true, do they guarantee that the conclusion is true? That's what if an argument is valid, then if the premises are true, they will guarantee that the conclusion is true. But here's another way to articulate or to conceive of that same idea. Is it possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false? If that's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, then true premises don't guarantee a true conclusion, so the argument is invalid. But if it is not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, that is, if true premises guarantee a true conclusion, then the argument is valid. But here again, we are only concerned with validity. We are not concerned with whether the premises are true or false. Okay?